consultant with Slalom Consulting here in Denver. I've been a developer and architect in the software industry for 15, almost 20 years. I like to do about anything that involves mountains. And continuing forward is the theme, also one of my favorite things, which is beer. So, with that subject, let's get started. So, what is RxJS? So, first question, has anybody seen this book? One hand, two hands. Oh, there's more. Okay. So, like anything in software engineering and computer science, we have this habit of taking old ideas and bringing new life into them, which actually is not a bad thing. So this design pattern is decades old. It came from this book, which was, well, I don't want to put a date because I'm going to get it wrong, but it's been around for a while. But the basic idea, if I'm going to contrast it against something simpler with my beer theme, is we have this very, very, very simple, hey, let's go write this little bit of code to go get a beer, and I have a glass of beer. So in and of itself, that's simple, right? Pretty easy to understand, but it's also pretty limiting. If I go and I take this thought and I expand it a little bit further, right? I'm in a tap room, I'm going and getting a beer, but what if I can get another beer from the same place? Even bigger than that is what if I can go and have the concept of other people can get a beer from the same place, and you can apply the same bit of logic to everyone. And that is really kind of the cornerstone piece. Whoops, I'm going to back up a little bit, or I'll stop and talk for a second. Of Rx is basically everything is a stream, if you will. Everything is a stream that anybody can listen to at any time. And that was the foundational element of the original pattern. But in that, in today's modern programming world, that has some pretty powerful and super effective ways for us to go and build applications. And we'll kind of get to that in a little bit more. The other side of it is functional programming, which I'm sure everybody has heard of because it's one of the more newer and sexier terms. So functional programming in and of itself, continuing with the theme, is I have an input, in this case it's a glass of beer, and I have an action that I'm going to take, which is going to be to drink beer, and then I'm returning the empty glass, right? Very, very simple, very, very basic. But then again, that's sort of the point, is we're going and we're taking something and we're distilling it down to a very simple, very concrete, something goes in, you do something to it, something comes back out. We use these functional concepts as sort of building blocks to make something larger, something bigger, something more coherent that becomes part of a larger application. And this is just simply a shorthand notation of it, which you'll see in many, many aspects of code. So another illustration, kind of continuing with that, is if you take the concept of beer, right? We start with malts. It gets turned into a wort if you have a really good beer, like a Russian Imperial Stout. Maybe it gets thrown into a bourbon barrel, goes into a keg, goes on down the line, and then ends up with me. The thing to note is that there is a flow through here, right? You are basically making a journey from point A to point B to point C and so forth. If you look at many things that we do with an application in modern development, you're doing the same kind of activities. You're getting something from this web service, you're getting something from this database, you're pulling all these things together, maybe you're running transformations on them, and then you have some kind of output that's used in an UI or sent to somewhere else. So the whole idea is that you have these executable chains where one thing feeds into another. And that's kind of the second cornerstone piece of RxJS. The first piece is the whole idea of the stream. The second piece is the whole idea that I can apply all of these functional elements to said streams to give myself a bit of additional punch and logic. And we'll kind of continue forward. So I'm going to kind of go back over to the fun stuff here a little bit, and we're going to talk about a little bit of the code itself. So I'll have to apologize. Let's see, can everybody see this? Or do I need to make it a little bit larger? All right, how's that?
Better.
Okay. So I don't have a super sexy user interface, and I apologize for that. That's really not what this is about. So, but we'll talk about the details. So what I've done here is gone through in this little bit between 18 and 22 is create a whole different set of beer variants, as I call them. So on line 21, I've created an array. On line 22, I have a complex object. So probably the better question of the day is, what on earth am I trying to do here? So these are all various variants of how I can create an observable. So an observable is a cornerstone construct of RxJS, and what you'll often see is this little guy here. I have a beer observable, and in this case, I'm creating it off of this, what I call a complex beer, which is an object, and then I'm subscribing to it. So if I actually go and I run this, and what I'm going to see here is my nice little complex object here in the console, and it's in a note that I'm actually completed. So an observable is basically made up or when I subscribe to it, I should say, 3 things that happen, right? You can think of it as a timeline and a set of events, as well as the potential to have an error, and a notification when I'm actually completed. So in this sense, I've gone through. Here I've made my observable of a complex beer, which has a name and a type. And then I've logged it. And that's what happens when I come back over to here. What you're seeing is this complex object that's dumped out to the log here, and then a note that says when I'm done. I can sub this out, and I can go and do this from an array, and I'm going to get basically the same kind of thing, except in this case, I'm getting each of the individual objects that are coming back from an array. And the reason I'm kind of showing you this is one of the cool things about Rx is that I can basically build an observable from really anything, right? The library and platform provides you to have the fine-grained control to create a series of events or a series of data that comes from, quite simply, whatever your heart desires, whether it be beer or something else. And a lot of times we sort of constrain ourselves to be thinking about more familiar, concrete elements, if you will, of mouse clicks and API calls and so forth. But one of the things to remember is that, one of the cool things about modern web development is we sort of exploded out. I'm running a little bit of a tangent, so you'll have to forgive me. We have these ever-increasing components that are basically trying to talk to each other. So a lot of our job today as developers is building out the tool sets to go and pull all the pieces together to make something happen in a coherent, easy manner. I know the thought's a little bit abstract, but these are one of the things that you can use to help facilitate that. Outside of going back to the subscription, in this case it's pretty simple. The other aspect of thing that I can do is I can hook this in, and I can go through. In this case, I'm getting simply mouse events, and I can stop. So this kind of goes into another subject here, and what I've done here to kind of look at the code to illustrate this a little bit better is I've created this subscription from this call, which is actually part of Angular. to give me an observable stream from the mouse move. So, and this probably highlights, because what we've done over here, if I'm going to compare these against the stuff I have up here where everything is singular, right? If I go and I have this beer, and I go and I do the array or the complex beer, it spits it out and it's done. It's over with, right? On this kind of code here on line 38, what we have done is we've created a true stream. Technically, the code above is also a stream, but the code here is actually ongoing. So if I come back, even though I'm not plugged into this stream, obviously my browser is still going through and hooking into and offering the mouse events. If I go and I start it back up, right, I'm hooked back into it. If I stop, the mouse events are still going on. And what this kind of highlights is the idea between both a stream and what we call a hot versus cold observable. And the best analogy I can do that kind of also sort of at least I think hits the point home is, I'm going to use beer again because I like to use beer. Who went to the Great American Beer Festival? Anybody? All right. So, if you bought a ticket and you didn't show up, the festival still went on, correct? Right? So that is a hot observable. Whether or not you are listening to it, or whether or not you're actively subscribed to the stream, it still happens, right? This up here, where I'm going and subscribing to this simple set of code to dump out an array of beers, as a cold observable, right? Data comes to you, it's cut off, it's done, it's complete, it's over with. That in beer analogies would be like going to a tap room and asking for a flight, right? You get the flight, you only get the flight because you asked for it, and then it's said and done. You're going to see a lot in Rx these very two contrasting pieces. And they become, as you go into the more advanced subjects, ever critical. And believe me, I have had bugs before where I subscribed to an event that already happened, and you're sitting there kind of like scratching your head. Why do I have no data? So, it sounds like a little, I don't know, obtuse subject, but it is a very important one, because also as you're going through and designing how your application is going to behave, and as you're using this platform, one of the tricks to Rx is to really kind of think a little bit more abstractly in the sense of how are things moving through the system and the pieces of my application. Because that's also going to begin to answer the questions of how I'm going to construct these lines of communication that make all of these parts go and talk to each other. Jump back to PowerPoint. But actually, we've kind of talked about a little bit the recap, and I'm going to move on to next, what I call the workhorse observables. And we'll go back to the code again real quick. So, the workhorse observables were kind of our first introduction to what we call the operators. And there is quite a few of them. If I jump over to ReactiveX, you're going to find, and you start going through, and you're like, what? There's a whole bunch of stuff here. What does all of this stuff do? So this is where the real kind of fun begins to happen, right? These are the building blocks that I can take to a stream of data, and I can apply, and I can group, and I can chain together to kind of make things happen, if you will. So what I've done here is I've created a simple array with a set of beer from one of my favorite places to go, Wellworks. Has anybody been to Wellworks? If you haven't been to Wellworks, you should go immediately. Truly, truly phenomenal place. And then what we're going to do here is, and actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and I'm just going to run it.
Bigger.
Sorry?
Can you make the code bigger?
Yeah. Sorry about that. Absolutely. So in this case, it's pretty simple, right? I'm dumping this out, and then I'm saying when I'm done. So the one thing to note is the most simple but most commonly used operator, which is map, right? And what is map? Map basically takes something in and puts something out. It's not any different from the map that you will use in other parts of front-end development or on other platforms, and it is exactly what it is, and no more and no less. You will obviously use it tons, but I like map in the sense of the kind of sort of continue to hammer this point home is you think about things, begin to think about things as a chain, right? I'm pulling pieces together to go and build an end unit that has the result that I'm looking for. So one of the structural components of observables with Rx, to kind of take a little bit of deeper explanation of what's going on here, is you'll see that we have these kind of chain of things, and they're all nested in this pipe method. So this is an actually relatively recent addition as of Rx 5.5 called pipeable operators, and now it's the standard with 6. And each operator is simply part of this chain. The second operator I have here is called tap, and tap basically does nothing. A lot of times you can go through and do things like, and this is honestly where you're going to see tap used more anywhere else, is you're trying to fix something, and I'm going to come in, I'm going to be like, what on earth is going on, right? And there's my console log. Tap doesn't actually process anything that's returned from it, even though you can return something from it. And that's really about the core of those two pieces. So one of the things that you may or may not have noticed is, what is this Bud Light doing in this list of awesome beers? Right? Yeah. Oh, the horrors. So the next kind of cool operator is, let's go and get rid of it, right? Filter. It is exactly what it says to do. I give it a predicate. And I go and I run, and it's, oh wait, it didn't work. My code broke. That's not good either.
The console log is before the filter.
Oh, whoa. Okay, you can come up here and help me. There we go. Let's try that. Make that happen. Now I made it all messy. But let's see if it actually works. There we go. Much better. No more Bud Light. But that actually illustrates a good point, right? Because one feeds into the next, which feeds into the next. So kind of going back to the whole aspect of chain and doing things in a functional manner, where the first link in the chain connects to the second link, which connects to the third, and then the third is going to get its input from the previous one. So in the case of the console log, right, it's pulling from what comes out of the filter. The filter is stripping out the Bud Light, thank goodness. So when it gets down to here, it's gone. And as you go and you start crafting these things into pieces of code that you're going to use and implement your own applications, you have to think about, again, this flow through the system and what's happening. So you can also begin to get kind of clever. Before we go on to this next one, I'm going to sort of digress a little bit, and I'll show you another concept that we call the marble diagrams. When I first look at these, I'll have to be honest, I was like, what on earth? Right? Because you can look at some of these things and they're like, they get quite crazy quite quickly. And then I went through and I watched this one discussion where the guy was actually writing these things out by hand on the fly. And I was like, okay, that's pretty impressive. But I kind of liked it because it kind of hit the point home. But the marble diagrams are a really important form of documentation because a lot of times just by looking at the code in more complex sets of observables, things can be really, really tough to figure out what truly is going on. So marble diagrams give you a way to sort of build out in a stream-centric approach what is actually happening. So in this case, we're taking something simple like map, right? So I have a complex object, and then what I'm doing with the map is I'm just pulling out the beer. So, whoa, in this one, yeah. In this case, let's see if it'll let me do it that way. There we go. Now I'm losing some of my formatting, so I'll have to stretch that out. How's that for everybody? A little bit more? I have to come down like that. Okay. So the best way to think of it is on line 3, we have what is considered a stream, right? So everything is an event in the stream, and this little kind of slice at the end is, the conclusion of the stream. So the item on line 5 is what we're doing to each actual event that happens in the stream. And then on 7, you'll notice that all of these line up with the beer above it because they're happening at the same time. So the best way to read it is if I'm coming up to the first one here, is I have a beer, it runs through this map function and gets turned into a Hefeweizen, which is just the stream, of course. And the same thing here, right? Beer number 2, run through the map function, gets turned into juicy bits. So this, again, is a simple example. And actually, as you become more familiar with some of the way that these work, and we jump back to the documentation, this is actually a lot of really good info. So you'll find yourself going through and decoding this and figuring out what's going to happen and what is actually happening. Because some of the, as you get into some of the observable operators, there is very subtle behaviors, and that's kind of another gotcha I'll point out out the gate, and something to be on the look for. And kind of going through this stuff is one way to go and get a better understanding of what truly is going on, and making sure that you're using it in the proper way. So let's go back, and we're going to be a little clever. So in this case, one of the things that you do, particularly when you have friends come, right, is you always talk about the altitude in the water, particularly when it comes down to alcohol. So what I've done in this example is throw in a delay, right? And then I'm going to go and get another beer, and then I'm going to go drink water. You'll notice that now, at this point in time, there's a bit of a delay going on. So if I'm going to go and I'm going to break this down, I apologize if this may be a little bit overwhelming. I have my map function, same one as before. And the other thing is, you notice is you have maps that feed into maps that feed into maps if you want. It's really a question of how you want to organize your code and how you want to group things together. One of the things about functional programming is things should be small and they should be simple individually and easy to understand, right? If I have a map that's 500 lines long, I probably didn't do something right. So in this case, I have something that's one line wrong, and once you understand what's going on here, it's pretty easy to wade through. So this guy here, you'll notice that we went back up into the beginning one, reused from and reused of. So of basically makes an observable string out of anything that I give into it, a single object. From will do it from an array. So if I go back to where I was, and I'm basically taking the individual beer that comes in here, I'm creating it into a child stream, and then I'm logging my drink of water, and then I'm adding my delay for 2 seconds. If I'm going to break this down, thank you so much. I needed that tremendously. I'm going to go over to my marble diagram because I actually have this written out. So this is what's going on here, right? So the Hefeweizen comes in. So this little slash here is my of, and you'll see where I come down and I have a second stream, which are these dashed lines. So think of these dashed lines as child streams. You can make streams of streams. You can combine streams together. You have a pretty huge amount of flexibility. And where this starts to come into play, we'll see a little bit more with the next one, is taking a little bit of a break off from this, is remember that a lot of times in complex front-end applications, we're dealing with data sources from all over. So the idea is that we need to sort of pull information from disparate sources, one API here, one API over there, some piece of state that's stored here, and pull it into a coherent unit. All of this stuff is going to happen at different times in different places, and we have to kind of pull it together into something that makes sense. But kind of the cool thing is, what I do here with this concat is I basically take all of this information and pull it back into one stream that can be consumed. So when I get over to this piece of code over here, I am going through and just writing this console log out just like I was before. So the one thing that may be not super apparent is on line 34, did I have to change anything to put that delay in? And the obvious answer is no. So when you're going and you're subscribing to Rx streams, you have this nice degree of separation from the consumer that's either below you or the fellow at the end that is the subscriber, right? So this code here on line 38, he doesn't care that I threw a delay in there. He doesn't even know how it happened. All he knows is that I get this event, and I'm going to put this information in here and I'm going to log it. That is a very, very powerful thing, because with this, you can go and create a user interface, let's say, that depends on currently selected beer. How the beer gets there, what transformations it goes through, how I might change the code, has absolutely no bearing whatsoever to that subscription. So this creates a nice way for you to go and isolate portions of your code in your software, right? How many times have you looked at something where it's like this big, giant pile of spaghetti monstrosity? Everyone's trying to go and butter their toast, walk their dog, and vacuum the house inside of 500 lines of code in the same place. Yeah, we've all been there. So this provides you the infrastructure to really start thinking about how I can separate this out, right? How do I go and pull these pieces apart and make something that's truly different? And I'm going to kind of move on to my last piece. And that's like my services piece. I'll go ahead and write this guy. Everybody read that? So what I've done here to give you a little bit of background is I've sort of created a pseudo service, which is loading breweries, with this whole idea as we start up the next portion of going on a brewery tour. So I know that when I have friends come and visit, what's the first thing they usually ask? Oh, can we go on a brewery tour? I'm like, absolutely. I am happy to take you on a brewery tour. So here's our brewery tour. And what I've done is I've dumped out, because I live in Boulder, 4 breweries in Boulder. So one of the things that we're doing here is this basically is functioning as an HTTP call without going through the little magic I have going underneath the covers. And then we're using another operator called switch map. So this is a good illustration because it has a little bit of bearing, because everyone obviously is going and making API calls. And switch map is a great way for you to handle a situation where, I'm going to illustrate this a little bit better, is, right? So you notice as I keep clicking, I have 16 let's start, but only one set of brewery shows up. So what actually happens is I'm being the bad user, and I'm just going and mashing my keyboard, right? Because again, that never happens with users, right? If I just tap it a little harder, it might start to work. Switch map basically goes through and says, okay, I have a new request. I'm going to go and abandon the old one, unsubscribe from it, and start the new one. So in the sense of going through in the context, let's say like an API call, what actually is going to happen underneath the covers in this situation is the call itself will actually get abandoned and no longer be issued. So you only make the one API call no matter how many times that you click. So this kind of construct that we have here with switch map is used all the time, particularly in the context of dealing with APIs. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment this out. I'm going to kind of go and show you guys a couple more pieces here. All right. So continuing with this sort of theme is I have this list of breweries now between Denver and Boulder. But what I've done here is I've sort of intermingled them together, right? So, which is kind of crazy if I'm going to go from Avery to Wine back to Boulder to go to Fate. But this is illustrating what happens when I use another way to combine observables. And combining observables is going to be something that's going to be, again, really important. And I'll kind of break this down a little bit more in a second. But what you're going to have to do, like I have in my current project, I'll have something like, make 2 API calls, but when the second one comes back, go and make this 3rd API call. And when everything is all said and done, run it through this transformation and turn into this nice little pretty object with a bow on top, right? These kind of things are going to be, well, ours is probably, some of ours are more on the extreme side. These kind of constructs, again, are going to be more and more common, right? A lot of times you don't have control over the information that you're going to get from another system, a server or a backend, wherever the case may be. But you have to go and turn this into sort of a coherent structure. So pretend for a moment that, I have this list of breweries and I have no control over it, right? Has anyone ever been in a situation where you have no control over an API and what it gives you? We all dream about it. So what you have to do with this situation is turn it into something that makes sense. I think the other side effect that I've had, which I could probably talk for days on, is the whole concept of how data has a completely different representation in APIs than what you may need in the front end, right? As we write information for a front end, you're going to find that APIs may give you too much information or too little. So you have to turn it into that nice little pretty package. So if I switch back to this list and I focus on what's going on here, I've gone through and I have this kind of mesh of breweries for our fake brewery tour. If I go and I look at the individual pieces in my nice little marble diagram here, I have my first string. And that corresponds to this guy. And I have number 2. And that corresponds to that fellow. So merge, basically, like you would expect, says, I want you to glue these guys together. And the way that Rx is going to do that is Avery comes in, it runs through merge, and it issues an event. Denver Beer Company comes in, it runs through merge, issues an event. And it turns these guys into a single string. So, again, from the perspective of my subscription here going on at the end, this code really has no bearing, doesn't care, doesn't know, doesn't need to know where the lists came from or how they were processed above. All it knows is that it's heading to a brewery, however impossible this list may be. So what we're going to do is make something a little bit more realistic, and we're going to switch it back out with concat. So at this point, we're staying up in Boulder, and then we wait, because we're driving down to Denver, and we're transitioning down to Denver. So if I go back to the greatest documentation ever, the marble diagram, you'll see that we've got these still 2 strings, right? Line 3 and line 5. Now what we have done is basically gone through and has taken line 5 and concatenated it onto the end of line 9. So the idea that I can go through and pull these 2 together and turn them into something that is a single unit that I have on line 51, 52, and 53, again, even in this simple example, is a really powerful thing, right? Because what I'm trying to sort of illustrate here with this example is, even though it's a little bit contrived, is that I can go and take information from multiple sources, glue them together, and turn them into something that has sense and context to another piece of code, right? And this other piece of code has no dependencies, no bearing, doesn't care. In many ways, it's, we've all talked about the idea of being able to go and properly layer and isolate, organize your code. This is one of the neater ways I've been able to go and create code that is actually truly independent from other pieces. So there's a lot of platforms that go through, and I like to put it, sort of guide you in the right direction, if you will, right? And there's other platforms that sort of guide you into the minefield, right? You've got to work your way around it to make sure that you can come up with something that you're going to look at in 6 months, and you're going to want to still be able to look at it. Rx is really good at kind of being able for you to create and modularize your code and turn it into coherent units. And let's see. And that was actually the examples I had. Let me go back and that was all the pieces, and that was the recap. So, what else is there out there? The best resources I have found is, let me go over to my browser, is ReactiveX, which is the main site for Rx. There's versions for it for all the major languages. You know, we're doing this example in basically TypeScript, but there's an Rx version for Java, for C#, pick your poison. So I think in Java is where I first started messing with it, Angular to be more specific, because it comes bundled with Angular. I think JavaScript is a really good learning place for it, just because everything that we depend on really is, at its nature, asynchronous. Whether it be a button click, a mouse click, an event from an API call, or whatnot, we have this whole plethora of things that have to happen to go and make our application function that we really don't have control over. So part of RxJS is to sort of give a framework that allows us to go through and make something come together. Another thing I will add is this little guy. I have my broken beer and spilled beer, and before you answer is why would I ever spill beer? It is a high learning curve. One of the challenges with this is it's really, really tough to convey it inside of an hour. I've tried this a couple of times now, and hopefully I've made some good points and got y'all interested. But the one thing I will give you guys is try it out, mess with it, see what it can do. A lot of where Rx shines are the really more increasingly complex things that you see in single-page applications. When you're dealing with multiple components, multiple data sources, multiple endpoints, and trying to make all of these things come together. And the other thing is, you're going to fail. You're going to fall flat on your face, and it's going to be an absolute crater of a piece of code. I'll tell you that because you can ask Ricky. That's exactly what happened to us. Don't let that faze you. So I had another friend who said, you know, you really need days to go over this, and he's probably right. It is one of the more powerful ways I have seen as play that allow you to go and do a front-end application and manage the pieces of it effectively. That's all I got for you. So, questions? Amen.
Yeah, so with Saga, just to give it a comparison, it's hard just out of the box to test those without the unit test being too tightly coupled. Is there something akin to like a Saga's test plan, which is kind of main library for doing non-couple testing with RxJS?
There is some tools that we have worked with on the Angular side that allow you to go and either deal with things that are specifically observables and understand that it's a string. Because one of the things, as you probably realize, right, if I go back to this code, and this is one of the hookups, right, this doesn't actually happen until I subscribe to it. If it's a cold observable, right, which in this case it is. So when you're building what is basically synchronous unit tests, that becomes a very, very serious issue. You can also, I'm not a huge unit test expert, so a lot of this I'm going to have to defer to say, yes, there's stuff available,
Sure.
But the details I have are kind of light on it, but there are techniques to deal with it, yes. Yes?
Have you seen rxmumbles.com?
No, I haven't.
It's very cool. It's a playground where you can like drag around marble diagrams and see how they actually work on the screens.
Oh, that's awesome.
Really cool resource for this.
That's awesome.
And you guys are working in Angular a lot?
Yeah, and one of the things, do we have any Angular developers? So is anybody using NGRX? Yeah, so Ricky and I are NGRX, for those who don't know, it is an angularized, I murdered that, version of Redux. But what it does as well is throws in Rx to it. So for instance, everything that's in the store is a stream. So you go and you ask for things from the store and you get an observable back. But when you do that, you can also run through the set of operators and transformations to turn something from the store into something that has bearing for the front-end component that's subscribing to it. The great thing about it is you can create a situation where I'm pulling 3 pieces of data from the store, and then the UI gets updated when someone else makes a selection or API call or something like that automatically. And that's a lot of the little pieces that are a little tough to understand in this short context is when you start connecting these things together, start thinking of things not as, if I'm going back to my PowerPoint, right? Not as a single thing that I call and get a piece of data back, but instead as a stream of actions where something can happen over and over and over that I get for free, right? That's the whole part is. In having done this for a while, those of you who have written code to go and get additional information or deal with their things or whatnot, when you go and you write this, you basically write it as a stream from the get-go, everything that happens for free. Whether your app is updated once, twice, 3 times, your view is always in sync. And a lot of these sort of combinations I have spent, ages and hours and time writing code that handle in other platforms over the years that Rx basically gives you out of the box. The only catch is you have to understand that you're going to be getting something sometime, right? Again, like you go and you ask for a beer, you don't get it immediately. Someone goes and gets it for you, so you have to wait however long that may be. And you have to write your application to accommodate for that. But if we're going to be realistic, we're doing that anyway, right? You're going to make an API call. It's not instantaneous, right? You don't know when the user is actually going to go and click a button, right? You can go and try and write concrete time frames around those things, but that code is going to break at some point. It's better off thinking of your app as a set of asynchronous actions from the start. I think I'm getting the wrap up, so any other quick questions? I'll be around if someone wants to pull me aside and we can talk more.